The reason that it's a risk whenever you're using data is very rarely 100% telling you to go one direction. Sometimes it pulls the other way. So how do we inspire organizations and individuals to actually act on their data and make a decision?
Fire, earth, wind, water. This is the Elemental Educator. And now your host, Tyler Comeau.
All right, alchemists, hello and welcome to the Elemental Educator Podcast. I'm your host, Tyler, and today we have a special guest that elevates educational and leadership expectations. Do you find data daunting? And if so, you're not alone. Many of us recognize that the technology in our organizations is constantly collecting data, yet we're often unsure of how to access it, make sense of it, and use it effectively to inform great decision-making. Selena is an expert in this field. She works with organizations and schools to develop strategic approaches to the data they collect, collate, and use. She equips employees at all levels to have highly effective data storytelling conversations, ensuring that all decisions are informed by evidence. Selena's expertise extends beyond her consultancy work. In 2022, she published her first book, I'm Not a Numbers Person, How to Make Good Decisions in a Data-Rich World. And in 2023, she released the Talking Data card deck for meetings. Her podcast, Make Data Talk, began in January 2024, and she's already made a significant impact. Welcome to the Elemental Educator Podcast, Selena. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me, Tyler. We're going to go through the data and data thing, I think, in this episode, so I apologize to everyone in advance.
We're going to flip-flop back and forth. From your perspective, the expert, what is the correct way?
I don't know, because when I lived in the UK, I started pronouncing it data, and then I was bullied back into saying saying data when I moved back to Australia. So I don't know. I'm not sure that there is a right way.
I think the Canadian way, and that's where this podcast is based out of, is data. But on a global scale, I think data is it. You know what? They're both recognized. It is what it is. We'll roll with it. The first thing I want to unpack with you, though, is how did you get to where you are now?
So I used to be a high school teacher. So I'm secondary maths and physical education trained. So I worked in lots of different schools, and I've got experience teaching maths and English and science and religion and PE and everything. And I went and taught in the UK, and it was a very different context to where I had been teaching in Australia. And the UK just uses a lot of data to track students. As teachers, we were compared. Our performance was compared at the end of the year, which I found really confronting because that's not something we do in Australia. And while there was a lot of kind of micromanagement and negativity around the way it was being used, there was also some really powerful ways that I could see data was influencing my teaching practice. It was influencing my classroom. It meant that I was able to see really tangibly when my students had improved, and I could celebrate improvements with them. And that was really rewarding. And I taught secondary, so I started to be able to have really good data-informed conversations with young people about their goals and what they were aiming for and what they needed to do to improve. And I moved back to Australia. And as I said, the Australian landscape, I guess, is probably maybe 15 years behind the UK in terms of the amount of data being used in schools. And I went back into this vacuum of basically nothing. So I started my doctorate. Yeah, as you mentioned, I've written a couple of books, and I taught up until the end of 2019. So I did about 16 years in the classroom. And then I thought, I'm going to give this consultancy thing a go because there seems to be a real need for people to be able to engage with data. And it's not something that we're necessarily taught, right? It's not something that comes easily to people. And yeah, I reckon I have the coolest job in the world now. So I'm very lucky.
Absolutely, you do. And I want to start by really diving into our earth, which is our core values and our root. And a teacher of 19 years, wow, that's an incredible journey in itself. What rooted you in wanting to start that journey?
Yeah, I always wanted to make a difference. I wanted to feel that I was contributing somehow. And my mum was a teacher. My grandma was a teacher. When I was in high school and we had to do work experience, I went into a primary school and I did my work experience there. And I think for me, the most transformative moment was really it was one of my first practicums. I had a real light bulb moment where I was teaching area in like year 4 maths. And this student didn't understand. And at this time, I was actually not sure that I wanted to be a teacher. I enrolled in the bachelor's degree, but I had this real light bulb moment in the classroom that day where this young person didn't understand it, but I rephrased it and reframed it and did it and said it in a different way. And the kid was like, oh yeah, okay, I get it. I was like, yeah, you've got me. And from that point on, I was like, this is such a great job. Like I absolutely loved teaching. Just good fun, hard work, but really good fun. And teaching teenagers, and for most of my career, I taught in all boys contexts. So it was always just good fun, lots of laughs that generally didn't take themselves too seriously. So it was good fun.
So you're rooted in the idea of wanting to help and support others. And that's a very powerful route to be in. And that little validation experiment that you ran, that's almost the start to triangulation of data. You had two of the factors down. You're missing that third piece in that first little one. We'll get to that later on, what triangulation means and how to go about it and where to work on it. But now let's shift to the work you're doing now as a consultant. And how is that earth, that core value of growth, of learning, of problem solving for you? How is that impacting how you work with organizations and people?
Yeah, it's a good question. For me, number one, it's that I'm showing up in service, ideally for other people. I don't want to waste anybody's time. I want it to be impactful, and I want to be able to talk through really practical and pragmatic solutions to support people. Teachers are really busy, and I lived it for quite a long time. I think I describe myself as a data storyteller, but also a grounded researcher. So I see, as a grounded researcher, part of my responsibility is to distill the learnings that I see happening across schools, because there are so many similarities, and then present them to others to help smooth their path a little bit and to help provide guidance. Yeah, I'd say it's very similar in a way to what I enjoyed most about
And
teaching.
it's very interesting that you like to use the word storytelling when you're talking about data, because a lot of people, when they hear data, they think typical statistics and math classes.
Mm.
But we also want to start infusing literacy when we talk about data.
Mm.
So what does that look like? And how do you actually instill the importance of being data literate?
Yeah, look, in schools, in many ways, it's an easier sell, right? Because we became teachers because we want to make a difference to young people, and so teachers are not wired to want to focus on the numbers and the metrics, because we don't ever want to reduce this human that we're there to serve and support and nurture. We don't ever want to reduce them to a metric or a number. So the sell for data storytelling for me in schools is actually quite easy, because it's the merging of the human story and the human experience with the numbers that we're getting and we're receiving from the data. I always make a distinction between being informed by data, not driven by it. And so when we're informed by it, when I work with schools and with other organizations as well now, I always talk to them about, when we're informed by the data, we've got the numbers, and we think about, what does research tell us about best practice and highly effective strategies? What do we know about the context? What do we know about that student, that family, the demographics of the school, maybe the cohort, all of those factors? And what do we know from our own experience? Because we've tried things before. We've been successful with some students and not others. We might have tried some things with that young person. And so we want to package all of that up, the data, the research, the context, and the experience. And then we use that collectively to inform the decision that we make. In some ways, it's actually an easy sell for me, as I say, to go into schools and go, hey, I don't want you to just care about the numbers. I want you to think about them in light of the humans that you're here to work with. And sometimes that messaging from me is quite different to the way that some people have been exposed to data previously with other leaders. I'd like to think that it can be a bit refreshing.
And data informed and data driven. I think a lot of people are actually data informed, but the buzzword is data driven.
Yeah.
And it's not that data is driving every single thing, because you talked about this as well. There's other perspectives. There's your core values and there's your earth, which I'll come back to in a moment.
Yep.
It's more just informing the decision that you're going to make.
Yeah.
Now, the largest part of that is the route that you find yourself in. The data needs to have alignment for you to truly believe in and invest in it.
Yeah.
So are you able to give an example here of a situation where you worked with where data aligned with a value and they just weren't putting the two together to make that informed decision?
That's a really good question. You could talk really about any of the data related to learning analytics. I feel like we've got a real ethical responsibility that if we know that there's a gap for a student, or if that there's something that they're struggling with, we've actually got a core responsibility to actually use that information to think, how do I best meet that student at their point of need, and how do I serve them best? Because we know not every student is the same and they're going to need different things. And so that can be really powerful. But in the same way, it doesn't have to just be limited to learning analytics. I work with a lot of other data in schools as well. So things like attendance and behaviour reports and student wellbeing check-ins and trackers. And again, I think there's a really clear kind of ethical responsibility around some of the wellbeing trackers that people are using, because if you're asking students if you're asking students to complete a survey explaining how they're feeling, and you're not acting on it, it's really poor messaging to that young person, and particularly if somebody was trying to reach out and seek help and you didn't. And I've seen that happen in schools before. Yeah, it can be really damaging, and that's certainly not in alignment. So when I do that type of work with schools, I'm really focused on what are your processes, how quickly are you responding to that young person, and how tightly is that feedback kind of loop coming back to them, because the last thing we would want is for a young person to be reaching out through a channel like that and then for us to not be doing anything with the information.
Thank you so much for sharing that. One of the pieces that we start to bridge between is we start to take that earth element and we start to bridge it with the air element now, which is overcoming adversity. And you mentioned it. We're looking at data of a struggling student, maybe not academically. It could be socially, emotionally, like any factor could be factoring in where data is showing us that something is not right. And there's adversity here.
Yep.
So the first thing that people see is there's a fear of these numbers. There's a fear of the adversity in creating that response to them. How can we overcome looking at data and just throw in a pity party over what we're seeing as results and actually actioning it?
Yeah, it's whenever I work with leaders who have people in their teams that are apprehensive about data, I really get them to focus on the positives. So there's often an assumption when we're looking at data that we're only looking for the bad things. We're looking for the gaps and we're looking for the areas that we have to work on and get better at. There's so much capacity to do that, but equally there is so much data that shows that students are growing, they're making progress, they're achieving, some of them would be achieving their best results ever. And so I think that's a really nice way into a data conversation is, what are all the really great news stories that are coming out of this information? And then equally, we can learn from that and we can action those learnings in the future, because if we know that something is working really well for a student, for a class, for a cohort, it's okay, we can think, what have I done differently? Why has that worked? And then how can I use that in other areas of the school or in other areas or in other, say, different subject areas or whatever it is, or different kind of KLAs or subject areas in the primary school. So there's a lot of positivity that can come out of it. So that's one way. I think the other piece for me that fear comes from, not so much fear, but distrust in the data. It comes from people not trusting the results that they're being given. So I work with schools a lot around, like, how do we increase the validity and the reliability of the information we've got? Because if it's not valid or reliable, we can't be expected to make good decisions and take good action, because we're actually acting on data that's not telling us the right story. Yeah, it's really important that we get validity and reliability. And sometimes that actually requires having a whole conversation at a whole staff level about what are the problems with these assessment instruments, what are the problems with the implementation of the assessment, what are the challenges with moderation across classes, whatever it might be, because you've actually fundamentally got to build trust in the data sources that you've got.
And you mentioned a very powerful point that I want to tap into here. Triangulation of data can mean a bunch of things. And for me, one of the things that I look at it for is triangulation can also mean if it's valid, reliable, and fair. And you've mentioned two of them for me. You've mentioned valid and reliable. And I'm hoping for our leaders and educators listening, let's define these right now for everyone. What is the difference between something that's valid and something that's reliable? Because these are crucial things when you're making data-informed decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Reliability is to do with, can you trust the instrument to continue to give you the same result each time? And that's hard because obviously humans perform at different levels every day and there might be variation. But I compare reliability to thinking about if you have scales in your bathroom to weigh yourself. You want that scale to be reliable because you don't want it to look like you've put on however many pounds or dropped all these pounds and it's inaccurate. That's just useless data. So that's reliability. Validity is the thing that you want to assess actually being assessed by the instrument. And so that there is always questions raised around standardized assessments. In Australia, we have a couple of nationwide standardized assessments that are used quite regularly. And so there are often questions about the validity of those. They're pretty solid instruments, but you could argue there are areas of Australia that there are Aboriginal First Nations communities where English is not their first language, and we're asking students to take an assessment at 8 years old in English. Now, is that the most valid assessment for those young people? No, not at all, to assess their reading comprehension or writing or numeracy or whatever it might be. It's also, I guess it's the alignment and how tight the outcomes of that assessment and the data, like how tight that is with what you're actually trying to look for. So I often think about if you were to go into a shop and you bought something and then you get a follow-up email and they're like, how satisfied are you with the product? And so you rate the product 1 to 5. And then if the shop was to turn around and use that data to say, this is the score that people are giving us for how good their experience was in the shop, there's overlap, there's grey, but it's actually not the same thing. When you ask somebody about a product review, you can't extrapolate that and say this has generally been their overall experience with us as a customer. So that's the validity piece. You want that alignment to be as tight as possible.
So I have to ask, the stance on standardized testing, do we like it? Do we hate it? Does it belong?
For me,
where are we at with
the
this?
piece, right? It's a useful piece of information. One of the challenges I've got with the systems in Australia is the turnaround time for the data coming back to the schools. So one of them in Australia is instantaneous. So students log out of the assessment and it's available to them straight away. So that's really powerful. A teacher can use that information tomorrow, really, to shape a lesson and to celebrate with kids and all of that. But the other standardized assessment at the moment is still about a 3 to 4 month turnaround to get the data back to schools. And it's really hard to know. Like if you see that the students have really struggled with one aspect of say, like solving equations in algebra, but that was 4 months ago and you've taught a unit in algebra since, are they still bad at that? I don't really know because they did this standardized assessment before I taught the unit. So it becomes really muddies the waters a bit.
And I think it comes back to a point you made earlier, Selena, about it's a data-informed decision, not a data-driven. If you're waiting for that 3-4 month test to come back to then create some kind of response to intervention programming, you're not using that data properly to inform your decisions that year, at least, maybe in future years for sure. You should be doing your own in-house kind of assessment, gauging. And this is where the other part of triangulation comes in. You're not just relying on the standardized test. You're doing your own test. You're doing a project. You're doing an experiment. You're figuring some other way to see what people know. And that's just not applicable to education. That's applicable to any occupation that's out there. How are you collecting information? Because if you're only collecting it one way, well, you're not really getting that multi-perspective, all-encompassing, ubiquitous angle of what things can look like. Now, this is where we start to tiptoe that line, though, between facing adversity and now acting on that adversity, which is our water element. And that's the changes that we want to implement as we move forward. So implementing data-driven strategies, it's actually, it can be simple, but I think a lot of people view it as quite complex. Yeah. So how do we ensure that there's fluidity and that seamless integration of these strategies within different organizational structures?
It's interesting because the thing that I love about data, like there's a perception that it's so black and white, and it's just not. There's so much gray in it. And so the idea of fluidity is that if you, say, gave your class spreadsheet to 5 or 6 teachers and you said, what are the main things I need to work on? They wouldn't all agree on the number one thing necessarily, because it's the old saying, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. And so we actually need a whole lot of flexibility in this space to think, oh, Tyler, you saw that in my data. That's really interesting. And to be able to collaborate and have that conversation, because every human's hugely impacted by all of the biases that we bring with us being human. But it means that we don't always see everything in the data. The other thing in terms of being able to be quite flexible and providing other options is even if, say, you and I are teaching in classrooms side by side, teaching the same year level, the same content, and we see quite similar challenges in our data and we think, okay, we want to tackle this particular problem. So say we both identify that cohesion in our students' writing is the biggest challenge for them right now. Now, the way that you go about teaching cohesion in your classroom, the action you take, is going to be different than mine. Like, we're not the same human being and we don't have the same relationships with the kids in our classrooms. They're different humans. And so, as I said, it's not as black and white as maybe what people think it is. There's a lot more gray. It's a lot more fluid, which I think is just the really fun part. To be honest, it's
It
probably not
is.
the
It's
complex
also
part.
the frustrating part though
Yeah.
too. One of the more frustrating sides of data with me, I'm not the biggest fan of admissions for colleges and universities, and I'm not the biggest fan of how we handle scholarships when it comes to academia. Because you hit it head on here. You said every teacher's different, everybody's different. If we're giving something based off of a percentage, based off of a number, sure, it's informing, but it's only informing a part of the puzzle. A lot of these awards are based off of single pieces of information and not a triangulation, which is super important. I'm hoping that we can dive into a conversation here around how does triangulation of data actually work when we're trying to do that? And then how does it drive our change process?
What like you were talking before about standardized assessment, right? And you said, what place does it have? And when it comes to triangulation, I think it's got it plays a great role, a really important role. When we triangulate, the idea is that we use 3 to 5. I limit it to 5, but 3 to 5 data sets, going back to the point before about being really tightly aligned with the thing that you're focusing on. So if you want to look at, say, students' ability to read or their reading comprehension, you want to have 3 to 5 data sets that are very tightly linked to reading comprehension. Now, we don't expect students to perform at the same level every time they do an assessment. Their results will shift a little bit. But what triangulation allows us to do is it allows us to discount any anomalies. So if a student is demonstrating, say, like 2 high results and then they achieve a result that's sitting around the middle, we can trust the 2 higher results and make some decisions for that young person about extension based on the majority of the data. So one of the things I always say is we want to trust the majority of the data. Occasionally, students will perform really consistently across the 3 data pieces, and that's very clear. But more often than not, there'll be 2 high, 1 middle, or 2 middle. It could be any kind of combination of high, middle, low. And then that's absolutely going to inform what we do in the classroom. So if I look at a triangulated spreadsheet of my class and I can see that there are students who are high performing across multiple data sets, then I'm going to need to think about what does that group of students need from me to extend them and to continue to extend their reading ability. The kids who are sitting around the middle, they're going to be reading different texts potentially and doing different activities to the students who are very capable. And then the students who are really struggling, then that's going to be potentially different resources, different scaffolding, different support, and maybe even like different programs. Like sometimes that leads to different reading intervention programs. Sometimes it leads to them working with other teachers or other professionals in the school. So again, and you referred to this before, sometimes people assume that we use data to inform our decisions. It's huge change. And it's not. It doesn't have to be. It's about the small tweaks that we make along the way that mean that we're just meeting our students at their point of need a little bit better than what we would have without it.
And these small tweaks, when we think about it, sometimes it's hard to start.
Mhm.
So, if you were to recommend a first piece or a first element of data that a teacher, a leader, anybody should be looking at, what kind of data should people look at first?
Yeah, I reckon there's 2 parts to this answer. So I would say absolutely start small and focus on one thing. So in secondary, focus on one class group. In primary, focus on one subject area. And to be honest, when it comes to what data should we be looking at, that's really up to you. Because when you triangulate, my kind of recommendation would be to think about what's the thing that you're most interested in looking at. So it might be your performance of students in your geography class, for example, in secondary. It could be science in grade 4. Whatever the subject area is, you've got to think about what does success look like and what are the best metrics I have that represent success. And sometimes I work in schools where attendance is a real challenge. And so attendance is significantly impacting academic achievement. So in those schools, they triangulate attendance data alongside some of the academic achievement data, because that's a really important piece. We can't be talking about improving student learning and moving them forward and helping them make progress if we just completely omit the whole data set that has really vital information about how frequently they're actually coming to school. Whereas in other schools, like I work with a school, and their average attendance across the entire school year on year is 94%. So for those schools, they don't need to triangulate attendance data because it's generally not a problem across the board. So it is thinking about what's the one small area that you can focus on just to give this a go. And then what are those 3 to 5 bits of data to try to just potentially bring them together to start to think, are there any surprises for me? Often data tells us what we already know. It confirms what we know and what we see in the classroom. And if that's the case, that's awesome. That's great. It's the anomalies and the things that surprise us that become then really actionable. And they're the things we remember. And I think about a student, Luke, that I taught a number of years ago. And when I was new to the school, and he was very disengaged in my maths lessons, he sat at the back of the room. He's very polite, but he wrote very little in his book. He was on his laptop the whole time. I just didn't get anything from him. And I looked at his previous maths results, and he achieved like C's every report card. And I was like, okay, that matches what I'm seeing in the classroom, right? So that kind of confirms what I know. And then I looked at 2 standardized assessment results, and I realized that for both maths and reading, he was in the highest band across the country for one of them. And in another one, he was in the top 2% of students across the country in reading and maths. And so those 2 bits of data showed me that he was actually a very high performing student, and the C in my maths class, or the C historically, actually didn't match what he was capable of. And so the triangulation piece, I just looked at just for him, just for Luke. And then I was able to think, what do I do with that? And Luke was 15 at the time. So I was like, my action was, I'm just going to go and talk to Luke. And we worked out a way of working together. He actually had never seen these exceptional results. He didn't know that his results were that good. So it was really lovely to be able to share that with him. But we negotiated a way of working that meant that I was providing him with more extension activities rather than the kind of the middle of the road difficulty questions that I was giving everybody else. And we came to an agreement that like he still had to do the same amount of work as other students, but he was doing different work and it was the same content. So that was a relatively small tweak for me to make. I wasn't producing a whole stack of new resources for him. I was purely just giving him different questions in an activity or in an exercise. So it was still the same content for him.
And that's so powerful too, because you're getting into the topic of differentiation, which is a massive buzz that needs to be happening. You need to be differentiating, adapting, modifying for all of the different unique learners in your classrooms or your workplace settings. And the best way to do that is to look at what the data is telling you, because it's telling you where your gaps are. It's also telling you the things that you're doing really well. We're sharing all these really great examples of data. I'm going to share an example of some data that I wasn't too fond of.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes from a school division that would track the performance of grade 7 students all the way through to when they would graduate. And what they would do is they would take this year's grade 12s and they would look at their historical grades and they would go back and report to all of the other grades. So they'd go back to the current grade 7s and they would say, here's how these kids performed when they were in grade 7. This is how you're performing. The data tells us that you guys are en route to have less graduates than this route or more graduates. And what does that even mean to these kids?
Yeah.
It means nothing. They're going to look at the number and say, oh, our number's lower than this number. Are you calling us dumber than the current class? It means nothing. The time is different. The learning was different. The people were different. The teachers were teaching different. Who has any idea what that means? There is some use to it. Don't get me wrong. It can inform general practice performance over time, but it's one snippet. And the hardest part that I hated about this was it was all just presented on a spreadsheet where kids were looking at a whole bunch of percentages, a whole bunch of numbers, and it became overwhelming. So one of the biggest pieces with implementing change that is data informed successfully is using an appropriate visual to represent your data.
Yeah.
How do people go about doing that?
Yeah, it's so true. And as the people who are potentially the data storytellers, so in that case, even if you were trying to tell that data story to those students, we've got a real responsibility to think about what is the best possible visualization that I could use to convey the story that I'm trying to share. Often that type of data is represented in, say, a scatter. So say their year 7 results are mapped against one axis, their year 12 results are mapped against the other, and every student gets a little dot somewhere, and there's a trend line. And that happens in Australia. There's internal assessment versus external assessment, and we map a lot of different metrics alongside one another. And that might be the only visual that you need to be able to say, you can annotate it, you can put kind of additional notes on it, but to be able to say, okay, our current 7s are here, and then this is where they would be predicted or projected down the track. I love spreadsheeting programs for being able just to put data into visualizations for us, but we need to be more critical users of those tools and think, I can't just go for the recommended chart that Excel is spitting out to me as the first option, because actually, if you have a graph with 50 bars in it, and you've got people trying to read all the different yellow bars all the way through, that's actually not a great data visualization at all. We've got to make the trends and insights really easily seen in the visuals that we present to people. And whether that's you're getting up in front of other people and presenting data to them, whether it's presenting it to students, whether it's presenting to parents, whoever it might be. But even things like, there's just so many options. There's bar charts, there's pie charts, there's line charts, there's box and whisker plots, there's lollipop charts. There's just so many options. We just got to think about what's the message we're trying to convey, and then what's the best way that we could possibly show that.
And the time is changing, and places like Excel and Google Sheets, they're starting to get to this point, but typically they have not used an AI-based thing to look at your numbers and say, this is the best chart for you. They're going off of trends and what people tend to use out of their programming. And so you're not necessarily representing your data the best way if you're just following a trend of what's always been used.
Yeah. Exactly.
The nice part about this, we get to the fun part here. And this is where we get to look at that data, and we've gotten to the point where we say it's time to make decisions. And we get to play with fire a little bit and take some risks. And the reason that it's a risk whenever you're using data is very rarely 100% telling you to go one direction. Sometimes it pulls the other way. So how do we inspire organizations and individuals to actually act on their data and make a decision, even when there's that hesitation that it's not 100%?
Yeah, very rarely is 100%. And one of the things I say as well is that data actually doesn't ever tell you what to do. Like it doesn't, you have lots of options of how you could act based on the trends or the insights that you see. So I guess it's important to keep an open mind and start to think about what's possible. The reason I often see that people don't take action, there's a few reasons why they could get stuck almost in a bit of analysis paralysis, if you like. They just keep looking at it, won't commit to the action. Sometimes it's fear. Like sometimes people are genuinely concerned about, what if I try something and it doesn't work? And then what are the ramifications going to be? What's going to happen to me? How is that going to look bad? Is there going to be any consequences for me within my team or my organization? And so we've got to try and really alleviate that fear as much as possible. And so a lot of schools that I'm working with now, really working hard on embedding action research cycles to normalize this whole idea that we identify something in the data, we identify something that we can work on, we try some strategies out, and we come back and reflect on whether or not those things have worked. And then we go again and we try to make further tweaks and refinements, and then we reflect on it again. And you can sit in the spiral a few times. And that starts to normalize that whole process of, this is not black and white, as we've said, and we're dealing with complex human beings in a complex system. It's never as simple as saying, this is what the data is telling me, I'm just going to plug in this new thing in the center, and therefore everything's going to be magically better on the other end. I think educators would be a whole lot less stressed if that was the case. But
100%.
Yeah, we've got to normalize that conversation around, what you try is not going to work for every kid immediately. You're not going to see the change straight away for everyone, but it's the opportunity to come back and loop back and think, who did it work for? Why is it working for them? Who hasn't it worked for? What tweaks can I make? So yeah, the fear piece is really important. The other thing I see sometimes in schools is, and it's also connected to this, but sometimes people have a really rigid like unit plan or lesson plans, and so they almost can't take action, and I've had many teachers say to me that they're not allowed to take action because They have to move on. Like they still have to teach the next thing tomorrow. And if what they taught today didn't land and students are struggling with it, they just don't have the time to make changes. And again, like leaders in schools, like I'm constantly talking to leaders about how do you give people the time and the space and the flexibility to be able to expand and contract those programs. We still need people getting to the end at the same time, but we've actually got to trust that people can loop back and reteach or revise or even spend less time. You might get data that shows your kids actually understand the topic really well and you can move forward a bit more quickly. But that flexibility is really important.
And this whole story that you're sharing just reminds me of Lewin's work of freezing, unfreezing, and that refreezing cycle. This is why it's not a simple cookie cutter. It's that whole, you're looking at data to make a decision. You need to unfreeze and then implement some of those changes that you want to implement. And then you need to refreeze for a little while and see how it goes. And that's the scary part for people, is going from that unfreeze to that refreeze and knowing if you've given enough time to truly know if your data is effective, if you're going the right way with it. So what's enough time to interpret data? What's the right spread that people should be looking at?
Yeah, so in a 6-month period, I would say in an action research cycle, usually about 4 meetings over 6 months, like half an academic year, is enough, because you really do need good 4 to 5 weeks of teaching time to be able to try something out and then to be able to collect good evidence of learning at the end of it. And things don't change quickly, so we do need to let them run for at least 6 months. But I'd be saying a minimum of five weeks. And often when people come back to those action research cycle meetings, they're bringing evidence of learning back with them. That then should be guiding the conversation about what next, because I've actually got solid evidence of whether or not it's working.
It's like what they say when you go to the gym for the first time in a while. It's people don't start to notice that you've gone until 3 weeks, and you don't start to notice that a difference until 5 weeks. You have to give it time to marinate. You have to give it time to sink in, and then you can start making some decisions. It's typically why those 30-day diets don't always work either. You don't give them enough time to truly set in. Now, okay, I'm getting off topic. I'm going to come back to it here. What are you hoping that people action in their lives tomorrow from your message?
Just love data, please. That would be awesome. No, I guess it's just the perception of some people have really negative perceptions about data, and that's because of the way we see it misused in the media. It's the way people talk about schools and compare them. The example you shared earlier, like they're really counterproductive, but actually we can be really furious at all of those uses of data. And at the same time, we can see the value of it in our own work and in our day-to-day. And so I think it's being able to articulate the discomfort with the poor use of it, but equally see the value. And I guess from what we've talked about today, I'd love people to be walking away thinking, if I was just to focus on one thing that's within my sphere of influence, what are the 3 to 5 pieces of data that I could triangulate for that to give me really specific information about how my young people are going? And then how can you use that? Have a think about how you use that in your day-to-day.
What a great response. Now, you have a couple books that you've authored. Which one should people start with?
I'm Not a Numbers Person is the kind of generic data literacy, data visualization, data storytelling one. So that's probably a good start. It's not an education book specifically. Leading Data Informed Change is another one. So if you're wanting to think about how to lead a change cycle, that's a bit of a process for you. Or further down the track, it's actually getting kids engaged in their data stories as well. So my last book is Data Informed Learners, and it's about being able to have conversations with students about their goals and their data, and supporting them in their growth through having the conversations rather than us just doing all the work on the outside and not involving them.
And where can people find these?
They're all on my website, so selenafisk.com. They're all available there.
Perfect.
And we ship worldwide.
And Selena, what is... There we go. I love that, worldwide. Now, Selena, what does your future look like?
Yeah, who knows? Evolving space. It's fun. Look, there's just so much need at the moment. That's what I see. And I'll just continue to support people as long as there's a need for help in data storytelling. There are so many people that feel that they're not numbers people. That's why I've named my book that. And so I really enjoyed, as a maths teacher, it's a pretty low benchmark, but I really enjoyed having kids just not hate maths. I'm like, if that's
it's not that low,
don't hate it. Like, just see that there's value and you don't have to hate it. Yeah. So yeah, it's probably just not hating it would be, yeah. Is that too low?
There we go. I don't know. There's a stigma. And I just had this conversation this year with people that I work with. If we talk about being not a math person, we instill in kids that they're not math people. And that's where that hate comes from. The lack of collective efficacy around our thoughts and perspectives of math as adults. You have so many adults in the world that hate math. I'm not the numbers person. And that makes the kids hate it.
Yeah.
And that needs to shift. We need to start talking positively about it. Now, you mentioned your website, but how can listeners get in touch with you if they want to unpack a bit more, maybe explore some opportunities with things that you can offer them?
Yeah, there's contact details on my website. There's also a newsletter, so I write occasionally, but I write probably more frequently on LinkedIn. So I'm just at Dr. Selena Fisk on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you much. Thank you so much for sharing. Alchemists, it has been my pleasure to sit down with Selena and hear her story. I hope that you've all really enjoyed it. Selena, thank you so much for taking the time to join me on the Elemental Educator podcast.
No worries at all. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Elemental Educator. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, find us on Instagram, Facebook, and X at Elemental Educator.